1944, this was the year. The fate of Germany shifted forever a year. When one single decision shattered the final hope of turning the tide of the war. A moment when a desperate gamble transformed into a devastating collapse. And this is the story of how that mistake destroyed Germany's last chance of survival. In the winter of 1944, Germany stood on the edge of disaster. Yet there still remained a slim thread of hope, even though the Eastern Front was burning under the unstoppable advance of the Soviet armies, and the Western Front was tightening under the pressure of the Allied forces. Landing in France, the German High Command believed there was still one final move, one final strike that could change everything. They believed that a daring offensive could break the Allied lines and force a negotiated peace, buying time, and perhaps even reversing the inevitable. But this hope rested entirely on one decision, the decision that would soon prove fatal. By mid-1944, Adolf Hitler had become increasingly detached from reality, refusing to accept the collapse happening around him. His generals pleaded with him to shift forces to the east, where the Soviet steamroller threatened to crush everything in its path. Operation Bagration was destroying entire German armies in weeks, but Hitler refused. Instead, he believed that the Allies in the West were weaker, that their unity was fragile, and that a powerful surprise attack could shatter their morale and divide their armies. He became obsessed with launching a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the same region where Germany had found success in 1940, but this time the situation was completely different. In 1940, Germany had the advantage of surprise speed and superior tactics. In 1944, they were exhausted, short on fuel, overwhelmed by air superiority of the Allies, and facing an enemy that had grown stronger, wiser, and better equipped. Yet Hitler insisted that the Ardennes would be the battlefield where Germany would reclaim its destiny. This insistence was the mistake that destroyed Germany's final chance. The German generals knew that the East was the real threat. They knew that a red wave was preparing to sweep across Poland and into the heart of the Reich. They knew that without reinforcing the Eastern Front, the war was already lost. They argued again and again that the limited German resources must be focused there, but Hitler refused to listen. He demanded that all remaining reserves, including the last elite divisions, be sent westward for his grand offensive. The generals understood that this was a gamble with no logic, a desperate dream built on illusions, but in the end they obeyed. They had no choice. Hitler's word was final. Thus, the stages of the last great gamble began. German troops were gathered in secrecy, moving at night, hiding from Allied planes. Tanks were positioned deep in the forest. Supplies were pushed forward, even though shortages were everywhere. Germany lacked fuel, ammunition, and winter gear, yet they prepared for one of the largest offensives of the war. The goal was simple: break through the American lines, seize Antwerp, cut off the Allied supply routes, and force them into chaos. But this goal was impossible from the start. The Allies had overwhelming resources, and once the offensive was detected, they would respond with crushing strength. Still, Hitler believed that if he could strike fast enough, he could shock the world and force negotiations. He imagined a miracle that would never come, and so on a freezing morning in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge began. The initial attack did catch the Americans off guard. Thick fog covered the sky, grounding Allied planes. German artillery thundered across the forest, and armored divisions rolled forward, crushing the thin American defenses. For a brief moment it seemed as if Hitler's gamble might succeed. German soldiers felt a spark of hope, the kind they had not felt in years, but hope alone cannot win a war, and soon reality struck back as the fog lifted. The sky filled with Allied aircraft. Thousands of planes unleashed destruction upon German columns. Tanks were destroyed, supply lines were ruptured, and movement became impossible. German forces were trapped on narrow forest roads with no fuel and no protection. The very resource Germany needed most, gasoline, became their downfall. Tanks that could have changed the battlefield stood frozen, helpless monuments of a dream that never came true. The Allies quickly reorganized. American forces fought with incredible determination, holding key crossroads, fighting in towns and forests, refusing to break under pressure. Reinforcements arrived from all directions. The German advance slowed, then stalled, then collapsed within days. The mistake became undeniable. Germany had thrown its last reserves into an attack that could never succeed. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet Union prepared its own massive offensive, one that would crush the depleted German lines like dry branches. Russia had expected strength in the west but found only chaos, exhausted troops, and empty supply depots because the reserves had been wasted in the Ardennes. The Eastern Front was left almost defenseless. In January 1945, the Soviets launched their winter offensive. It was overwhelming, unstoppable, and devastating. German lines shattered, cities fell one by one, and the road to Berlin opened wide. This was the direct result of Hitler's mistake. His refusal to reinforce the East ensured that the war would end months earlier in complete destruction rather than in a prolonged struggle back in the West. The German failure in the Ardennes left the army crippled. Thousands of irreplaceable soldiers were lost. Tanks that had taken months to assemble were burned out in forests and fields. Supplies that could have supported a defensive campaign were gone. Germany now had no ability to stop the Allied advance from the west and no strength to hold back the Soviets from the east. The mistake had destroyed more than a chance. It had destroyed the heart of the German war machine. As the months passed, Germany fell apart. The Rhine was crossed, Berlin was surrounded, and Hitler still refused to accept reality. He blamed his generals, he blamed the weather, he blamed everyone except himself. But history remembers the truth. Germany's final chance was not lost because of fate or bad luck. It was lost because one man refused to see the world as it was. He gambled everything on a fantasy, and that fantasy doomed his nation. The commanders who survived later wrote about the chaos. They described how they tried to warn Hitler, how they explained the danger, how they begged him to save the Eastern Front, but he ignored every warning. He believed in victory while standing in the ruins of defeat. Yet the story of this mistake is not just about military failure. It is about a moment when pride overwhelmed logic, when ambition replaced reality, when a leader chose illusion over survival. And that is why the Ardennes offensive, or the Battle of the Bulge, became more than a battle. It became the turning point that sealed Germany's fate. If those reserves had been sent east, the war might have lasted longer. The Soviets might have been slowed. The collapse might have been delayed. Perhaps some form of negotiation could have emerged. Perhaps Germany could have resisted until the Allies reconsidered their demands, but none of that happened. Instead, the mistake consumed the last strength Germany had. The soldiers who fought in the Ardennes felt this truth deeply. They marched through the snow, freezing, starving, pushing their tanks with bare hands, desperate for fuel. They saw the futility of their struggle, yet they continued because they had no choice. Their courage was real, but the plan they were serving was impossible, and as Germany retreated, the world understood that the end was near. The last chance was gone. The final hope had been thrown away in a forest where strategy died under the weight of arrogance. The war that had begun with lightning speed and brilliant tactics ended with a disastrous blunder that destroyed everything. In the final months, German civilians felt the impact of that mistake. Cities burned, refugees fled, armies collapsed, and a nation descended into chaos. The mistake of 1944 had opened the gates through which destruction poured endlessly. The story of this mistake is a reminder that wars are not only won on battlefields but also in the minds of those who lead, and when leaders fail to see truth, the consequences fall upon millions. Thus, the mistake that destroyed Germany's final chance was not simply a military error. It was the decision to believe in hope without reality, to trust fantasy over strategy, to chase a miracle instead of accepting the truth. The Ardennes offensive became the final symbol of a war already lost. It marked the moment when Germany spent its last strength in a battle it could never win, and so the year 1944 stands as a warning etched in history, a year when one mistake sealed the fate of a nation and changed the course of the world forever.